I've said many times in my videos that and classes that I encourage my students to get the best paper you can afford, and there's a good reason for this. I've got two sheets of paper here beside me, and this one here on the right is my favorite, Arches 300-pound cold press paper. And just looking at it, you can see it's got a little bit of texture, and it's got a real firm thickness. It's almost like cardboard. You don't have to buy the 300-pound, 140-pound for smaller paintings. Like anything under 10 by 14 should work just fine. You might want to tape it down, but the lighter weight will be acceptable for painting. Now over here I have a greeting card. Actually, it's a watercolor greeting card, and I believe it's made by Strathmore, and it's a lot smoother, and paper's a little bit thinner, and I believe, yeah, if you look on this side, you can almost see kind of a waffle weave. I'm going to see if we can get in close enough to see it. You've almost got kind of a regular, yeah, you can see it there. It's like a regular texture, a pattern in your paper, whereas my other paper here has a lot more irregularities. This is a mold made paper, whereas this one is machine made. It's made in a, you know, with machines, and it just has that regular pattern. And so that's the difference just by looking at them. But let's just paint with these two pieces of paper a little bit and see what other differences we can notice as we try to encourage a good painting to turn out here. I've been enjoying painting lilacs lately, so let's do that. Grab some violet, and lilacs generally have a triangular shape, so I'm just going to quickly rough in that. One over here, one over here, and another down along here. Spray of flowers. Now, one thing I notice right away is I'm not accustomed to the smoothness of the paper in my brush. Just kind of skips across the surface, but that's okay. It does. The other thing I've noticed is, I mean, I don't mind a smoother paper, but the paint seems to settle on the top just a little bit more. I'm going to grab some other colors to drop in. The other thing I'm noticing is, yeah, the paint just sits on the surface of the page just a little bit more. Now we want to also encourage our picture, some of the colors to run, so let's add some water here. And already I'm noticing that these colors are kind of staying where they're put. I'll add some water here. But a lot of these, yeah, a lot of the color just kind of wants to stay where I put it down the first time. And for a painter like me who works in fluidity, I really struggle when my paint doesn't want to move across the page. So let's just keep going and see what we get here. Okay, I'm going to give that I'm going to add a little bit of green first, actually. I'm going to paint just as I ordinarily would. Add a little green. Just grab what I have in my palette. Okay, so we'll let that dry for a minute, and we'll come and work over here with the same kind of idea. And you watch too and see what you can see for if there's any differences. Now, of course, every painting is going to be different. No two paintings are ever the same. One thing I like about this more textured paper is that you just get a more textured look. Already there's kind of variations in color just from the paint settling into those textures. At this stage of a painting, like these lilacs, my main concern is just catching that shape, the kind of triangular shape of the overall flower. And one more over here. As this is drying, it's really granulating and separating into some beautiful tones and colors. I like it. Just gonna add some water, let things move. It's interesting, I've got a lot of green moving into this lilac. What you can do if you have a color that starts wanting to take over, you can push that away by adding a little bit of water or another color. So, I mean, you can blot it up too with the dry brush, but that's not that interesting. Let's just drop in some color that will just kind of shove it out of the way. Anytime you're introducing a fluid into an area, it's going to want to push what's already there. If it's wet or even if it's dry, it's going to want to do it a bit. Let some of those colors flow again. I like open shapes, open as in adding water, letting those colors move, so I don't have just a solid line of one color or of one shape, just like a cutout. I don't like that. I want to add little areas of openness for that color to move out across the page. Okay, so I've got version 1 and version 2. Inexpensive, smooth factory-made paper and the more expensive mold-made rag paper. We're going to just give them a chance to dry and then take a look and see how they work, how they've come together, and then we'll take a look and see what it's like to do a second layer and how they react when you start layering paint on top of more paint. Let's give it a little time to dry and then come back. Okay, so everything's had a chance to dry, and let's just take a look and see what we've got here in our two paintings. As you can see, the one on the left here, they both dried really nicely. There's lots of pretty fluid areas in each painting. Just zoom in a little bit so we can take a look. And of course they're both different. Every watercolor painting's different, and you can see the different colors flowing through, which I really like. And now is the time when with a painting like this, I'd start adding a bit more detail and layering some color on there and some glazes. So let's do that and see how the paper reacts to adding those glazes in. And I'm going to start on this side again and just mix up a little violet over here. And start adding some shadow areas and some shapes. The one thing I should mention is that this isn't the worst watercolor paper out there. It's not buckling too much, although it definitely is curving a bit more than you would see on this one. But it's not doing any pilling, which sometimes when you get, when you get cheap paper wet, it starts to, the fibers start to loosen and make those little pills and bumps. And it's not doing that, at least not at this point. Another thing I'll mention is that if you use masking fluid in watercolor paper, a poor quality paper like this, when you remove the masking fluid, you often have a struggle not having that paper or the masking fluid lift the paper away. And of course that's a disaster. You don't want to tear your paper when you're removing masking fluid. Now, one thing I do want to show you that I definitely feel like I get more with the inexpensive paper than I would with the good quality paper is if I was to, you actually get a little bit more freedom to move color around. If I take my brush here in this area and moisten it, you can see that I start moving that color and I can actually lift it right back to white. And you don't get that with the better quality paper nearly as much. Let's just try it over here. If I wet an area here, you can see with the other paper, as soon as you start scrubbing back and forth, it goes to white. Over here, as soon as I start moving back and forth, it actually doesn't move much at all. There's a big difference in how it lifts, how the color lifts on the page. And while it's nice to be able to correct a mistake by lifting off that color, it does become a problem when you're working with, when you have brush work happening and you want your layers, your successive layers to last. And that's really quite pretty. And then I'm just going to do this bottom one here. And I'm going to paint around this leaf shape. Again, now when I start working with these fluid colors and letting things run, that's when I might start having trouble with things wanting to lift off the page. So I got to watch for that and use a really light touch. And if you're finding that your paper is causing things to lift, the color to lift when you're painting, then it might be a good idea just to work on it on having a bit of a lighter touch when you're painting. Okay, so those layers are done. And that's actually looking quite pretty. Again, like I talked about with moistening the color and with my brush, it does want to move. And the green's not doing it nearly so much because it's made with phthalo blue, which is a staining color. So you might want to work more with staining colors when you're using cheaper paper. But even these, as I've added these darker layers that they're gonna sit on top of the first layer that I painted as well. And so that's when we start getting these layers that really move when you start trying to paint, in further depth over top of them. And then that's when your painting starts to get almost a scrubbed look, because you're adding color and you're moving the color underneath around, and it just kind of takes away from that freshness. Just a quick, if I touch, I'm going to lose this line. If I touch a wet brush to that purple, I'm just going to try to not. Don't mind if some color runs over here. And just a few little brush strokes. Give that a chance to dry. So that's my cheaper paper. And then quickly switching back to this one on my Arches watercolor paper. And again, I just want to kind of delineate those shapes, my lilacs. And on this one, I'm going to actually go darker on this side because that's where my color flowed a little darker in the to begin with. And I really like the way my brush kind of stutters along this textured paper. I like the texture more than a really smooth paper because it just gives you a little more texture on your watercolor painting. It gives your brush just that little skip to it, which is kind of pleasing. And I enjoy it. And I'm accustomed to it. And of course, you always like better what you're used to. And again, if I'm working in this area, say, and I have a clean damp brush, I have to scrub pretty hard before I get any of that to move. In fact, I have to get my paper towel and I have to scrub. And actually, if you do that on this paper over here, it will start to pill. So that's just, it's a quality issue. Just another difference you're going to observe. And I think I'm going to leave that be. Let's quickly work on those leaves. And look how that just makes that stem pop right out. We'll put another stem there. Incomplete shapes can serve their purpose so well. Better than complete ones, actually. I love just suggesting a leaf shape and let your viewers' mind fill in the rest. They will love the challenge. Okay, so we'll let that have a chance to dry. And then we'll compare the two and we'll talk about a few more differences between that good quality and the poor quality paper. Going in to add some dry brush or wet on dry finishing strokes here. Just to kind of put in some details and give the paper a little tryout on how that kind of technique goes. I'll go back to the factory made on this side, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. That's quite a wet stroke that I just added there, and you can see actually right away that it starts pushing the pigment around. And that's probably my biggest objection to poor quality paper, is that as soon as I start introducing water over a dried area, I start getting not just movement of that moist pigment I just placed, but the pigment underneath it. And that starts to give me funny edges and just a few effects I really don't care for. You can see how whitish that is. Rather than showing the green that should be underneath it, it's showing just kind of a whitish patch where the color has lifted and moved. And I love adding, because I do so much where I'm adding water to pull, already moist color around this layer that I just added. I really don't want that water that I introduced to move what's underneath that moist color that I placed. That kind of spoils my plans, and then it changes the way I would approach watercolor as well. Another thing I noticed with this cheaper quality paper is you can see there's like a darker green line here along the leaf, and often and along here too, the paint kind of dries a little darker at that edge where the wet paint meets the dry paper. And I see that much more with the poor quality paper, the student grade, than I do with this better quality paper. Here I get much more. I mean, there's still the occasional where it dries a lot, the edge dries a little darker, and that's has to do with how the pigment moves in the wet wash. But I don't have the same contrast, I think, between wet and dry. And that is partly to do with, I think, how this artist quality paper absorbs the paint just a little bit more. And so you don't get those dark edges as your wash dries. And whoop. Just going to do the same thing on my artist paper that I just did on my student paper. And that is just taking some fairly dark pigment, adding it in, and then adding some water, clean water, with my brush to pull that color and move it around. And you can see that it stays still the original color that was underneath it. The green that had dried remains, and I don't, and I can go in with another color and drop that in and let it flow just the same way as I was doing in my very first layer. I can continue that in future layers without worrying too much about the paint underneath moving around. If I were to scrub with my brush, I would see that those colors may be moving a little bit, but really I generally paint with a very light touch. You're not going to see that color moving around. Back to this one. That's curling quite a bit more, and that's another drawback. You can see how much that's curving. That's another drawback of the paper. You can see how little this one has buckled. And a thinner paper is just going to do that. So I'm just grabbing that phthalo blue, dropping that in, moving it around. And it just sits on the paper just so much more. And then as well, you're getting some movement of this dry pigment that I didn't have before. And that's gonna, and how much that pigment underneath moves is gonna depend on whether or not it's a staining color. But whereas with this paper, you're always getting some absorption of color, and this one you don't get nearly as much. And I know that if I were to take my brush to this really pretty blue area right here and try to layer over top of that, I can lift color right off with just the lightest brush stroke. Just see how easy that was. Actually, let's try to do it without any scrubbing at all. I'm just going to press a little dot of water right to this area here. And with my paper towel, I'm going to just blot, and you can see it's slightly lighter. And you can see what's on my towel here. This is what I lifted off just with that one little press. So you can just see how the color just really sits on top of the paper. So I think that was a very thorough overview of the different types of two different types of paper: an artist quality paper, my Arches 300-pound cold press, and then a student grade, a factory made, smoother coated paper. I say coated, but it does have something in there that just keeps it from absorbing the water the same way, is what I mean by that. And it just doesn't respond the same way. So if you're having trouble with your paintings, try a different paper. Try getting the best paper you can afford, and see how it responds to your paintings. And who knows, maybe that'll make everything just that much easier for you. I believe it, and I recommend to all my students that we use the best paper that you can afford, and then you'll just get more comfortable with painting and having consistency in how your paint responds to you.